Carlos Mendoza bought a dead mountain for $50 and believed it would change his entire life forever. He held the deed in his trembling hand and looked at the land spread out in front of him. Steep mountain slopes, bare and exposed, severely eroded. Trees were scattered across the landscape like bleached bones left behind after something had consumed the forest decades ago. Nothing grew beneath them. The soil was hard-packed clay that had been compacted and destroyed by decades of hooves. Rocks jutted out everywhere, exposed by serious erosion. Goats had been grazing here for 40 years, eating everything that tried to survive. No farmer wanted this land. No developer saw any potential at all. The previous owner had literally paid Carlos to take it off his hands, just to be free of the property tax burden. Carlos was 58 years old. He'd worked in a factory in Veracruz for exactly 30 years. He'd saved every single peso he could manage. He'd dreamed of owning land, real land, a place where things grew, a place that was truly his. He'd spent his entire life savings on this mountain, 50,000 pesos, which converted to roughly $50 at that time. Everything he had accumulated, everything he'd saved since he was 28 years old. His family thought he was completely insane, crazy, beyond reason. Carlos lived in Veracruz state in Mexico, in the mountains near the Sierra Madre Oriental. This was cloud forest country, misty, cool, constantly draped in clouds. The kind of place where things grew thick and wild and lush if you let them protect them. But nobody let them anymore. The forest had been logged by companies, grazed by endless livestock, burned by farmers clearing land, stripped and cleared for pasture to feed animals that destroyed the ecosystem. What remained was deeply degraded and slowly dying. Carlos's wife Maria sat in their small kitchen when he showed her the deed. She didn't speak for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. She just stared at the paper. When she finally did speak, her voice was quiet and heavy with disappointment. "You spent everything," she said. "It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of loss." "I bought land," Carlos said. "Real land, where things can grow, where I can work with soil instead of machines." "Nothing grows on that mountain," Maria said quietly. "That's why it cost nothing. That's why nobody wanted it." She was right. But Carlos didn't care. He'd spent 30 years in a factory. He was tired of machines. He wanted to work with soil. He wanted to plant something. He wanted to see growth, even if nobody believed in it. The first year, Carlos walked the property every single day. He examined the soil carefully. He looked at the few trees that remained. He studied the damage deeply. The goats had eaten everything down to the ground. The erosion had carved deep gullies into the hillside. The springs that used to flow from the mountain had dried up completely. Nothing was alive here. But Carlos noticed something. In the few places where the goats couldn't reach, the steep cliff faces, the rocky outcroppings, plants were growing. Small plants, herbs, things that survived on almost nothing, things that smelled medicinal when he crushed them in his hand. Carlos started researching obsessively. He went to the library in the nearest town, which was a 2-hour drive from his mountain. He read everything about cloud forests. He learned about medicinal plants and their properties. He learned about plants that grew wild in these mountains, plants used by indigenous people for centuries, plants that were valuable to herbalists and pharmaceutical companies. He learned something important. The forest, if allowed to heal, would produce those plants naturally. He didn't have to farm the mountain. The mountain could farm itself. He just had to protect it from further damage. In 2008, just months after buying the mountain, Carlos made a strange decision that confused everyone. He removed all the goats. He stopped letting anyone graze livestock on his property. He stopped clearing land for cultivation. He simply decided to protect it. He built a sturdy fence to keep out livestock. He posted signs warning against trespassing. He hired a local boy to help him watch the property. People in town thought he was completely wasting his time and money. Why spend money protecting useless land? Why not clear it and plant crops? Why not graze cattle like a normal farmer? Carlos didn't explain himself. He just worked. He just watched. He protected the mountain and let it heal on its own timeline. He believed in something that nobody else could see or understand. Nothing happened for 2 long years. The land still looked dead. The erosion scars were still visible. The springs remained dry. Maria grew increasingly frustrated. She wanted him to admit the mistake. She wanted him to sell the property and recoup what he could. But Carlos just kept waiting. He just kept protecting. He believed, though he couldn't fully explain why. Then, in 2010, something fundamental changed in the mountain. Rain fell. Good rain. A wet season that lasted longer than usual. The seeds that had been dormant in the soil for years, seeds from plants that had grown there decades before the goats came, began to sprout and germinate. Small plants appeared unexpectedly. Then more. Then herbs that Carlos recognized from his research. Plants with names. Plants with purpose. Plants with properties and medicinal value. By 2011, the mountain was transforming visibly. Grasses came back to life. Shrubs and bushes filled in the bare spots. The canopy of the remaining trees thickened and expanded. The understory became dense with vegetation. And underneath, in the shadows and cool places, the medicinal plants emerged and multiplied. Small plants with distinctive leaves. Plants with documented properties. Plants with real, measurable value in the market and to herbalists worldwide. Carlos began harvesting carefully and sustainably. He took only what the forest could afford to give and still recover from. He took only what wouldn't damage the ecosystem or its future production. He dried the herbs in the sun. He learned exactly which ones were which. He learned their properties and their market value. He started contacting herbalists and medicinal plant dealers in Veracruz City. He sent careful samples. He described what he had. He explained that his plants were wild-grown, from a recovering forest ecosystem that was healing naturally. The first sale came in 2012. A local herbalist bought 5 kilos of dried medicinal plants for 500 pesos. It was almost nothing financially, but it was something real. It was proof that the mountain could actually produce value. It was proof that his faith had been justified and his sacrifice had meaning. By 2013, Carlos was receiving orders from across Mexico. Herbalists knew about his mountain. They knew the plants were wild-grown and rare. They paid premium prices. 100, 200 pesos per kilo for plants that nobody had wanted just years before. By 2014, Carlos was earning enough from the medicinal plants to actually live. Not luxuriously, but comfortably. He'd turned an investment that everyone thought was worthless into genuine income. His life had transformed completely. By 2015, pharmaceutical companies in Mexico City were contacting him. They wanted bulk supplies of specific plants. They wanted to know about the forest. They wanted to understand the ecosystem. Carlos was careful. He only harvested what the forest could produce sustainably. He refused to clear more land or expand the operation. He wanted the forest to stay intact. He wanted the healing to continue. Maria finally believed in the mountain in 2016. The medicinal plants had been producing for 4 years. The forest had recovered in ways that seemed impossible. Springs were flowing again. Birds had returned. The mountain had come alive. She walked with Carlos through the forest one afternoon. The canopy was thick. The understory was full of life. The medicinal plants grew in carefully tended patches. It was beautiful and thriving. "I was wrong," Maria said simply. "I thought you were throwing everything away. You were actually building something extraordinary." Carlos didn't say anything. He just squeezed her hand and smiled. By 2017, Carlos had turned down multiple offers to sell the property. Corporations wanted to buy the mountain and extract the plants industrially. They offered him money, real money, enough to retire, enough to live comfortably forever. He refused every single offer without hesitation. "If I sell," he told Maria, "the forest dies again. They'll harvest everything. They'll destroy what took me 10 years to build." Instead, Carlos created partnerships. He worked with herbalists and small pharmaceutical companies. He trained local people to harvest sustainably. He created jobs on the mountain. He built a small facility to dry and prepare the plants. By 2020, the mountain that Carlos had bought for $50 was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not because he'd developed it or improved it industrially, but because he'd protected it, because he'd let it heal, because he'd understood that sometimes the value of land isn't in controlling it, but in listening to it and respecting its natural rhythms. In 2023, a documentary filmmaker came to the mountain to film Carlos's story. The film showed the before and after. It showed photographs of the barren, eroded mountain from 2008. It showed the living forest of 2023. It showed the medicinal plants. It showed the springs flowing. The film won awards. Carlos became known throughout Mexico as the man who'd restored a forest through patience and faith. But Carlos never became wealthy in the typical way. He never sold the land. He never extracted maximum value. He lived simply on the edge of the forest. He walked the paths every day. He protected what he'd helped restore. He became a guardian of something greater than himself. When asked why he turned down millions of dollars, Carlos gave the same answer every time. "The mountain was dying," he said. "I saved it. Now it saves me. That's enough. Some things are worth more than money." By 2024, the forest had become a nature reserve. Carlos partnered with environmental organizations. The mountain was protected legally. The healing would continue even after Carlos was gone. The medicinal plants would continue to be harvested sustainably. The springs would continue to flow forever. Carlos stood on the mountain one clear afternoon in 2024, looking at the thick forest that had grown from barren earth, and thought deeply about patience and faith, about how you can't rush healing, about how some of the greatest transformations happen when you stop trying to force change and instead allow it to unfold naturally. He thought about Maria saying he was wasting everything. He thought about the people in town mocking him. He thought about the corporations trying to buy the mountain and exploit it for profit. He thought about the mountain itself, how it had taught him, how it had shown him that value isn't always visible immediately, how it had taken 10 years of protection before the real value emerged from beneath the damage, how the forest had secrets that only time and patience could reveal. The soil that had been hard-packed clay was now rich and alive with life and microorganisms. The springs that had dried up now flowed constantly through the mountain. The forest that everyone said was dead had become one of the most productive medicinal ecosystems in the entire region. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with land is nothing. Sometimes protecting is more powerful than producing. Sometimes the greatest harvest comes from letting the earth heal itself and revealing what was always there underneath the damage. That's what Carlos's mountain taught him. That's what it teaches everyone who visits now. But the value wasn't money. It was life. It was healing. It was faith rewarded. It was understanding that some things matter more than profit. It was knowing that you can change the world by simply choosing to protect instead of exploit. Carlos's legacy extends far beyond his own mountain. Other farmers in the region have begun following his model. They've learned that patience can produce results that exploitation never could. Universities now study Carlos's mountain as a case study in ecological restoration. Environmental scientists point to his work as proof that degraded ecosystems can recover if given protection and time. The pharmaceutical companies that once wanted to buy the mountain now source their medicinal plants through Carlos's sustainable harvesting network. Indigenous communities have been brought into the harvesting processes, ensuring that traditional knowledge is respected and compensated. The forest that was once considered worthless has become a model for sustainable development. Maria, who once thought her husband was throwing away their savings, now speaks at environmental conferences about the power of faith and patience. She tells the story of how she couldn't understand what Carlos saw in that dead mountain. She talks about the moment she finally believed, walking through the thick green forest with him, realizing that he'd been right all along. Young people from across Mexico come to the mountain to learn from him. They come to see what patience looks like. They come to understand that the greatest wealth sometimes comes not from extraction, but from protection. The $50 Carlos spent on that dying mountain has indirectly created hundreds of jobs, protected an entire ecosystem, inspired environmental movements, and proven that faith in nature's capacity to heal is not naive. It's one of the most practical investments a person can make.